And next up, we have Portland State University researchers Kathy Inman-Behrens, Rachel Norda, and inclusive marketing strategist Sonia Thompson, who will share insights from their research on Gen Z and Millennials.
Welcome to our presentation at the U.S. Book Show. I am Dr. Kathy Inman-Behrens at Portland State University.
And I'm Rachel Norda, also from Portland State University.
And I'm Sonia Thompson, an inclusive marketing strategist and consultant.
Today, we're going to be talking about data and best marketing practices in our presentation, Library Experience for Gen Z and Millennials. How can libraries better reach Millennials and Gen Z?
This is us. We've already introduced ourselves, but we'll include the contact information at the end of the video as well if you'd like to get in touch.
So a couple of years ago, the New York Times published this article with the title, Craft Beer Looks Beyond Young White Dudes with Beards. The craft beer industry in particular, was facing slower growth, and they wanted to figure out how could they exceed the growth that they were having so that they can continue to expand their reach and their audience. And what they realized was they were really focusing their efforts on one specific type of demographic. And as they started working to promote craft beer to African Americans, to women, to Latinos, to Native Americans, they discovered that it wasn't just white men who loved craft beer. Other people loved craft beer too. They just had never considered it or had never tried it because it wasn't something that was ever marketed to them. So once they got in the habit of engaging these communities where they were with marketing that was relevant to them, they were able to open the floodgates to a broad variety of people who loved the product that they had, and the industry has been growing much more rapidly ever since. So for many local libraries, they might find themselves in the same position as the craft beer market did. A lot of times for local libraries, people go whenever there are children between 0 and up to about 8 years old. Then people often go whenever they are adults and they have school-age children or younger children. But when it comes to thinking beyond the people who most often or most frequently go to libraries, there are quite a few other groups who are being left out of the conversation who could be avid readers and avid participants and patrons of libraries. That includes Gen Z, people of color, Spanish speakers. Fun fact for you, by the time we get to the year 2050, 1 in 3 people in the US will speak Spanish. That also includes millennials, African Americans, and manga and graphic novel readers. Their sky's the limit in terms of the number of people that you have the opportunity to reach out to, and that could be wonderful patrons of your library. It's just a matter of reaching out to them specifically so they know that they do indeed belong with you. So the question that we want to ask you today is, how would your library patronage change if you put intentional effort to engage these particular communities? Now, it doesn't have to be all of these communities that you are working to engage, because that might feel overwhelming. But if you chose to pick 1 or 2 of these and put intentional effort over a period of time, I bet you might see a change in the makeup of the people who come to your library and the amount of people who come to your library.
So at last year's inaugural U.S. Book Show event, Kathy Behrens and I shared the results of the Immersive Media and Books project for 2020. And this analyzed consumer media habits for books, but also for TV, movies, and games, and also investigated how libraries fit within that ecosystem. So we've recently come back from the field with a follow-up project. And this data is focused on Gen Z and Millennials from 2022. We decided to hone in on this market because we found in the first study that these folks are the most avid readers and book buyers and library borrowers. they're also more racially diverse. So our 2022 data includes over 2,000 survey respondents, and they're nationally representative of Gen Z and Millennials. So these are folks aged 13 through 40. And there are quotas in the survey for race, region, and gender to ensure that representativeness. So the top level findings of this data are available in an open access report that we've published, and feel free to get in contact with us for more information. You can also still access the 2020 data, which is on the panoramaproject.org website.
So let's get into some of those exciting findings from 2022. And I want to note also that our previous study, all the participants had to have engaged with a book in order to take the survey. However, this time there was no screener question. So this is representative of Gen Z and Millennials who may never have touched a book in the last 12 months or even identify as readers or be interested in reading. So it's a very interesting look at Gen Z and Millennials. So Gen Z and Millennials are just not using libraries as much as they should be. They are the lowest percentage of library card holders of any demographic. Only 53.6% of them have visited a local public library in the last 12 months, even including curbside services. And shockingly, only 27.8% of them use the digital library resources in the last 12 months. I think that an assumption has been that because Gen Z and Millennials are very mobile forward, that digital resources would be the thing that they want most. Our data suggests that they are using it barely 25% of them.
We also found that Gen Z and Millennials have book discovery that differs from the general population that we had surveyed before. So from our 2022 data, we saw that they are mobile first and they're cross-media discoverers too. So you can see from this slide that streaming TV movies that are adapted from books is the #2 way that these folks are finding books. And the #1 place of discovery was on social media through their phones. So Facebook and Instagram were top social media platforms, followed closely by YouTube and TikTok. And we also captured data about how many of these folks are buying books based on ads from Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. So again, you can always reach out to us if you're interested in that data. Much like we found in the 2020 survey, discovery is highly distributed. So even the #1 ways that people are finding books and where they're finding books only captures, in the instance of where they discover, for example, 30% of the audience. So this is also good news because it means there are many ways to reach Gen Z and Millennials.
And let's get into some of the more delectable pieces of our data that have to do with media consumption outside of books. To our knowledge, ours is the first survey to examine book consumption alongside video games and streaming media. So 53% of our survey population identified as gamers. As you're building collections, you might want to think about games as an important draw for people who might want to be using library services and are not doing so quite yet. 52% of them identify as fans, and this ties also to how they're discovering the #2 way that they're discovering books that they want to read is through existing franchises, like other forms of the story in different media. So they're discovering books almost 30% of the time on their phones in social media feeds, and 82.6% of them check their social media at least once a day, but as frequently as multiple times per hour. So I think this is a big shift demographically that isn't true of Gen Z and boomers. So who are these folks? And this goes back to our 2020 data. They are more multicultural and diverse than previous generations. You'll see more slides in our deck about that. They're among the most avid readers, and we defined avid as reading 4 or more books per month in any format, ebook, audio, print. They have very high levels of cross-media discovery. They consume more audiobooks than the general population. And we actually have quite a lot of very interesting data about podcasts versus audiobooks in that we're not going to be talking about right now, but contact us for more about that. They are also more influenced by social media reviews than the general population. 60+% of US TikTok users are under age 30. And they're a lot like, I mean, maybe you've heard of the TikTok phenomenon, but books that make me cry get my money, says Iman Chaudhry, and many people like her. So TikTok is a phenomenon that librarians should be watching for.
In tying in with that cross-media discovery and how tuned into that the Gen Z and Millennial generations are, a great example of this is Bridgerton. So print sales of the series grew 3,000% and ebook 8,000% after the release of the Netflix series. So the fact that the cast of the TV show was so racially diverse was also vitally important in that success.
I also want to add, because on the earlier slide, you were showcasing just how people were discovering, particularly from Gen Z and Millennials. I am Gen X, neither of those, but I discovered Bridgerton on social media because so many of people in my community and my social media circles were talking about it. And I didn't want to be left out. So of course I went and binged the series, and that's how I discovered they had the books as well. So again, it's just I wouldn't have heard about it if the cast wasn't so diverse and it was speaking to people in my community. And it was just something that spread like wildfire as a result of the word of mouth that comes from people feeling like they were seen. Going back to people feeling like they need to be seen, as you start to think about serving people from underrepresented and underserved communities as a means to showcase that they do belong with you at your library, that your library is a wonderful place for them to be. Remember that one of the ways in which you need to communicate that is through the visual imagery that you are putting forth. That can be in your marketing, that can be in the people who work in your library, that can be people on your social media feeds. Remember that people need to see themselves or who they aspire to be reflected in the visual imagery that you put forth. Representation matters, and representation allows people to just quickly decide, is this something that is for me? Or is this something that isn't for me? So whenever you see yourself, that gives you permission to take that next step forward. But whenever you don't, you kind of go off to the next thing. So remember, as you're thinking about your audience and how to reach them, and as you're thinking about expanding your audiences, that also means expanding the visual imagery that you're putting forth.
And so the kinds of representation that Sonia is talking about was directly acted upon by the Multnomah County Library in Portland, Oregon. Perhaps you may know that the Public Libraries Association had its annual conference for the first time in 2 years because of COVID, but its annual conference in Portland last March. And in preparation for that, the reason that the PLA chose Portland was because of the exemplary EDI work being done by Multnomah County Library. During COVID, when library staff recognized that Black and Brown people were bearing a disproportionately larger burden of the harms caused by COVID, they looked internally. They did listening sessions with patrons. They listened to staff, and they made some interesting changes. So they already had an existing We Speak Your Language program featuring Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and Vietnamese, but they they hired new people to do translation and fast-tracked information dissemination during COVID in all of those languages. They added 2 staff positions to serve Somali patrons in the Somali language in a neighborhood that has a lot of Somali residents. And it also added 33 Black cultural library advocates at branches in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Much to Sonia's point, when people walk into their local library and they see somebody who looks like them, they automatically feel more welcomed. They can see, hear, and feel that this is a space for them. And then conversely, from, there's sometimes in rural communities, there can be pushback against progress. And yet rural libraries are by far the largest part of the public library system. You can see 77% of all US public libraries have 25,000 or fewer residents. Of those, 25% have less than 2,500. So if you hold that in your mind, and kind of the ways that rural communities can often be slower to embrace EDI, understand that Gen Z is 48% racially diverse. That's true even in rural communities as well. And some rural librarians have been getting pushback against things like Spanish language programming, like story hours. That inclusion isn't a nice to have. It's just got to be kind of a central premise for urban and rural libraries and suburban libraries, in order to talk to Gen Z and millennials. And then I'll note that, thanks for that slide. That the Oregon Library Association created an anti-racism toolkit. And I've got the link right there. It's ola.web. And then if you just keyword search anti-racism, this toolkit will pop up. It's about a 40-page guide. And they are convening 6 cohorts in very rural communities, with those with about, one of them has more than 25,000 residents, but all of the others are quite small. And they're leading conversations around how they can diversify their collections, they can be a more friendly workplace to non-white people, and how they can welcome in patrons who are not white.
As you're thinking about how to engage a broader base of consumers, remember that the experience that you deliver will be a core component of that. Customer experience and inclusion or inclusive marketing are inseparable twins, right? So if you think about you are delivering an experience whether or not you plan that experience out or not. So why not take the time to ensure that you're delivering an experience that not only is inclusive, but one that is remarkable, one that people will want to tell their friends and family about, one that will extend the brand or will just be epitomizing who you are as a library, what you stand for, and that will get the people who are perfectly suited to be patrons of your library to come on in and bring others with them. One example of just making sure that you're leaning into customer experience is me whenever I went to a cupcake ATM machine that the Sprinkles Bakery has. I can't tell you how many times I've talked about this cupcake ATM machine, how many people I've told, how many people I've taken to this cupcake ATM machine because it was so remarkable. It doesn't have to be something so out of the box all the time or something that costs a ton of money or over the top. You can create a remarkable experience no matter your budget, just with a little bit of time, focus, and creativity. And you can create something that is worth talking about, that people will want to experience over and over again and bring their friends who are part of their communities. As you are working to engage diverse communities, especially if you are not a part of that community, I know sometimes as I engage with people, they get a little nervous about how to do it respectfully, how to do it authentically, how to do it in a way that doesn't feel like you're being performative or pushing people away. So just know that this isn't something that you have to figure out on your own. There are a number of resources, both free and paid, as well as best practices and frameworks that you can use to get you to a place to where you are well positioned and well suited to engage these communities and make them feel like they belong with you. And so it won't get to a point to where you're focusing on inclusive marketing. It'll just become a natural part of the way you operate. If you'd like some additional resources and help with that, I've got some free resources on my website over at inclusivemarketing.co and /starter kit. So if you go there, you can get signed up and I'll send you some resources that will help get you going if you want to dive deeper into this topic.
So to finish up, we have some recommendations for librarians as you go forward with this goal to attract Gen Z and millennial patrons and to be inclusive in that effort. So our first recommendation is to focus on your library brand by deciding who you are as a library. So what are your values? How do you want to show up for the world? And answering these questions will help you to establish a foundation for reaching audiences more inclusively. You can find new audiences where they are by entering the conversation that's already happening in your patrons' minds. So practically, this might look like engaging with other media and increasing your library offerings and tie-in events, like with Bridgerton. We had talked about Bridgerton before, and you might have a viewing event, for example, for that book/TV series. And since Gen Z and Millennials are finding books on social media, use that as a way to connect with your readers. For example, you might do a reader advisory via social media. So, a virtual Ask a Librarian in the social media space. And in short, you're trying to capture an audience who currently aren't going to the library or using the digital library materials like they could be. So these are some tips to get you there and to get you started on reaching them. That's it for us. Thank you for listening. And here's our contact information again if you'd like to get in touch.
Well, that concludes our lunchtime program today. We're going to take just a couple of minutes here, a 2 or 3 minute break. We'll be back here right around 2:30 to start the second half of our Libraries Are Essential program. So we'll see you back here in 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks.